The work we'll be considering today is a panel from a pulpit designed and sculpted by Nicola Pisano, which was completed in 1260. A bit of background is necessary to put this work into its historical context. Pisano lived and worked in Pisa, Italy in the 13th century, and he was both an architect and a sculptor. Pisa is recognized for its outstanding medieval art, and the Square of Miracles is one of the most exceptional architectural complexes in the world. The complex consists of the Pisa Baptistry, that's the round building, then the Pisa Cathedral, the large building in the middle, and then the very famous Leaning Tower of Pisa, and then the low-lying white building behind those three is the monumental cemetery. Now, baptism was an important rite of passage in medieval life, and if you were a resident in Pisa, there was one Christian church, the Catholic Church, and the building of a place of worship was often the primary focus of an entire community for hundreds of years. There was little separation between church and civic concerns, and baptism was the point of entry into both the civic and the spiritual community. The Baptistry in Pisa, Italy, clearly shows the transition from Romanesque style to Gothic style, so let me explain. The grand Gothic cathedrals that were erected over hundreds of years were a source of tremendous civic pride and often the primary source of work for artists in the area. Work was begun on the Pisa Cathedral in 1064 and on the Baptistry in 1153. During the construction of the monumental edifices, which took over 100 years, the original architects would pass away and others would have to continue the work. This changeover often meant changes in the design that would reflect the current trends. In the Pisa Baptistry, the original style was Romanesque, and you can see the typical curved arches on the lower stories. As work continued, Nicola Pisano and his son Giovanni were brought in to serve as both the architects and sculptors. Nicola was responsible for the upper stories and the dome of the baptistry, and he adjusted the plans to the newer Gothic style, evident in those peaked arches and more intricate details. So the building embodies this transition between the two styles. Nicola Pisano was also commissioned to create the pulpit for the baptistry. In later years, his son Giovanni created the pulpit for the cathedral. The baptistry pulpit stands over 15 feet high and is in the shape of a hexagon, rather than the typical rectangular shape. This decision was probably influenced by the round footprint of the building itself. We are going to examine the relief sculpture of the Nativity on the baptistry. As you can see, it has not survived the last 800 years without damage. Several arms and heads have been destroyed. I suppose with the number of wars fought, periods of iconoclastic cleansing, and natural disasters, we're fortunate to have so much of it still intact. This work is a relief sculpture made of marble. The term relief comes from the Latin word to rise. In relief sculpture, the figures appear to be rising from the stone. They are still firmly attached to the stone behind them. They're not freestanding, but they are more than just etched onto the stone. They have form and substance. Before I move to more serious matters, can I just point out the goat in the bottom right who is scratching his head with his hoof? I just love that. It's such a realistic, fun little detail in a serious work. In the center, dominating the work, is the massive Virgin Mary reclining. Joseph is seated in the bottom left corner, while two midwives give the infant Jesus his first bath. In the upper left, we see the Annunciation. An Annunciation is when the angel Gabriel brings word to Mary that she's going to conceive and bear the Messiah. In the upper right, we have the Adoration of the shepherds as they gather around the baby Jesus in the manger. To the modern eye, much of this work is very confusing, but to a medieval audience for whom it was sculpted, the work made perfect sense. It was not unusual for a painting to include multiple parts of a story in one work, and here we see the same thing in sculpture. It is perhaps a bit disorienting to see Mary and Jesus more than once, but if you begin reading the work in the upper left and work in a U shape, you'll get a good portion of the story. Now, the size of Mary can also seem a bit strange. If the central Mary were to stand, she wouldn't fit inside the frame of the sculpture. And in contrast, Joseph seems quite small and uninvolved, sitting over in the corner. This is due to heretic scale, a device commonly used in various periods of art. Basically, size has nothing to do with realism, everything to do with importance. In these stories, Mary is the central figure, and the veneration of the Virgin Mary had increased significantly during this time period. We can clearly see in this image that there are ideas at work that are strange to those of us outside of Orthodox or Catholic strains of Christianity. First, Mary is composed, regal, and somewhat unattached to Jesus for a woman who has just given birth. That is our 20th century need for realism surfacing. Paintings and sculptures in the Middle Ages were not just used to tell the story, but to communicate doctrinal concepts and spiritual truths. Depending on where you fall on the religion spectrum, these concepts will feel natural or foreign to you. But the point is, they felt very natural to the original viewers. I'll just proceed with the medieval view of Mary to try to clear up any confusion. Doctrine held that Jesus was conceived while Mary was still a virgin, and that she remained a virgin until her death. Some even believed that she delivered the baby Jesus in a miraculous way that left her hymen and therefore her virginity intact. There was also the belief that she delivered with no pain, hence her calm, serene expression post-birth. Her seeming detachment from Jesus is due to the fact that he is fully man and fully God. He is not an infant in the usual sense. He is her Lord. Again, the work is communicating far more than narrative detail. It is giving us a glimpse into the theology of the incarnation at that time. Extra biblical sources included the story of midwives being present at the birth. And one of these midwives, so the story goes, doubted that Mary was going to deliver the Messiah. This woman had a withered hand. And in some artwork, as she bathes the infant Jesus, her hand is miraculously restored. Hence, midwives are frequently included in the artwork of the Nativity. Eventually, this element was eliminated in Western art, but it continued on in the Eastern Church. Mary's reclining position in this work could be due to the custom of lying in after a birth. All things to do with birth and death were considered sacred, and a number of rites prescribed how these events were handled. A lying-in period secluded the mother and protected her from resuming work too soon after giving birth. After a month, there would be a churching ceremony to reintroduce her back to society and to give thanks for her protection during the birth. In our lives, the death of a mother during childbirth is a rare occurrence, but that was not the case in the Middle Ages or ancient times. Care for the mother and her ritual purification were serious considerations. In light of the doctrines concerning and surrounding Mary, Joseph was relegated to a benign caretaker by many. He is often portrayed as elderly, hence not a threat to Mary's virginity, and sleeping, so that he doesn't witness the birth. In contrast, animals who are untouched by sin are frequently pictured watching everything that's going on. The representation of the Annunciation is clear enough. Mary is shocked by the news and then humbly accepts the angel's words. In the scene depicting the adoration of the shepherds, we also have angels present. This can be referred to as an annunciation to the shepherds or an announcing to the shepherds, but since the shepherds have now arrived at the manger, the scene is typically called the adoration of the shepherds. You may have noted that Jesus' manger seems to resemble a coffin more than a manger. Allusions to the purpose of Jesus' birth, that is, his death, are frequently present in nativity art. Sometimes an apple to denote the first and second Adam, sometimes there's a cross, sometimes the swaddling clothes resemble funeral wrappings. Beyond the spiritual meanings present in the sculpture, the work of the pulpit as a whole is significant in the entire timeline of art history. Up to this point, religious art adhered to a set of standards that were stylized. The way biblical themes were presented in art hadn't changed for 1,000 years. In the north, in France, sculptors had begun to move toward a more graceful realism, and we now refer to this style as Gothic. Pisano had been exposed to the style and would in fact adopt the Gothic style to finish the exterior of the Baptistry. However, Pisano, absorbing Gothic sensibilities, was going to leap forward, becoming a driving force in the coming Renaissance. It is significant that the pulpit for the Baptistry was completed in the year 1260. That is the date used by art historians to mark the beginning of the Renaissance. It's been noted that changes in art are often gradual, but occasionally a work is seminal, marking in an instant a shift in development. 3rd century Roman sarcophagi in the Compostano in Pisa, the monumental cemetery, were the inspiration for the beginning of the Italian Renaissance sculptures of the 13th century. In particular, the Phaedra sarcophagus was the model for Nicola Pisano's animal scenes on the pulpit in the cathedral. It is not as if artists in Italy were unfamiliar with classic sculpture and then they rediscovered it. In reality, they were surrounded by the ruins of ancient Roman civilization. But the development of art had moved them away from the classical works toward a focus on the truths of Christianity. And ancient Greece and Rome had valued the individual and celebrated the human as the pinnacle of creation. Even their gods and goddesses were very human and were represented as larger, more powerful versions of regular humans. Moving away from their pagan roots, the early church rejected much of the artistic culture that surrounded them. Now, Nicola Pisano, drawn by the relief sculptures on these ancient Roman sarcophagi around him, incorporated not just the style, but the content of Rome. In particular, 2 sarcophagi provided models that he incorporated into the panels on the pulpit. Compare the woman, her clothing and headpiece on the left, with the panel on the sarcophagus, and you can see the similarities. The Virgin Mary strongly resembles an Etruscan matron reclining in Roman fashion. The clothing of the surrounding figures is Roman, not medieval. The melding of Christianity and classic themes is most vividly apparent, however, in a sculpture just under the Nativity. The figure is the virtue fortitude. He is copied from the nude standing in front of the female figure on the sarcophagus. But that is not all. Around his shoulders is the lion cloak that signifies that this is Hercules of Greek mythology. Hercules slew the Nemean lion and made his coat into a cloak with protective powers. Now, Hercules is a natural representation of strength and fortitude, but equating a half-god Greek with a Christian virtue goes far beyond borrowing Roman art principles. For the very first time, we see a borrowing of classical concepts and melding them together with Christian ones. The Renaissance is identified by this very melding, a coming together of classicism, humanism, and Christianity into a brand new way of thinking, a new approach to science, and new ways of creating art. The Western world is on the brink of a seismic shift, and the pulpit in the Baptistry in Pisa is the first tremor. Now, if you'd like to read more about the development of art, you can head to my blog, kellybagdanoff.com, where we believe art is too important to ignore. I regularly post articles and videos on a wide variety of art history topics, along with homeschooling articles. So be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a thing.
Thanks for watching. Make sure to like this video by giving us a thumbs up below, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss great commentary on classic works of art. kellybagdanoff.com is your source for great content and curriculum, as well as devotional materials using the medium of art. Make sure you visit and subscribe. Pablo Picasso said, "Art washes from the soul the dust of everyday life." So take a moment to share this video, because art is too important not to share.
See you later, alligator.